Hello and a very warm welcome to this video. Thank you very much indeed for clicking on it. Before I get to the meat and purpose of the whole thing, could I prevail upon your patience and kindness to advertise this extraordinary bibliographical rarity? It consists of 3 beautifully produced hardback volumes of essays containing the real best of Oxfordian research essays over the past 20 years that were published in the De Vere Society newsletter by some of the finest Oxfordian scholars of, as I say, of the last 2 decades. The edition is a limited edition of 300 numbered copies, so there aren't that many around. They're just hot off the presses, and you're going to have to move quite quickly if you want to get one. And the way to buy one is you need to go to the De Vere Society website, which is deveresociety.co.uk, and click on the shop, which is in the top right-hand corner of that page. And there you'll find, obviously, the shop, which opens up, and it's the first thing on it, the Great Oxford box set, limited edition. And then you click on that, and the rest should be pretty obvious. If you've done any online merchandising buying before, you just go through the thing and it will be sent in a very nice box to your home. As I say, you can't dilly-dally about this. I have on this channel, I think, nearly 17,000 subscribers, and as I say, there are only 300 of these wonderful, beautifully produced editions. So get your skates on, and I hope you're lucky in managing to get one of those 300 copies. Okay, to the main meat of what I want to present to you today. A speech that I gave last month at the Charterhouse, a beautiful Tudor building in the very centre of London, which was once the home of Edward de Vere's cousin, the executed Duke of Norfolk. It was part of a conference presented by the De Vere Society in conjunction with the Shakespeare Authorship Trust. The conference was called To Seek the Light of Truth, Mysteries of the First Folio. Of course, it's the 400th anniversary this year of the publication of Shakespeare's First Folio, so the whole thing was about that. My speech was particularly concerned with Ben Jonson's encomium to Shakespeare that appears in the First Folio, an 80-line poem. I had assisting me the actors Derek Jacobi, Annabel Leventon, Costa Chard, and Richard Clifford, who read out the poem in between my commentary on it. I very much hope you'll enjoy this. It has lots of interesting material in it. I have to warn you, though, that my appearance is not terribly prepossessing. I've been injecting myself with something disgusting called chemotherapy to try and push back prostate cancer, which is inoperable and has spread into my bone. So I do look like the ghost of Hamlet, or even worse. Please forgive it, please ignore it, please listen to what I'm actually saying, because I think there, as I say, some very interesting material in this talk, and the purpose of the talk is to show how Ben Jonson knew exactly who Shakespeare was. One other quick word of warning before we get going is that I'm going to interrupt the speech very briefly, just to add something that in my exuberance I forgot to add on the day, but it is an important point, important enough for me to want to interrupt the speech and say it. So that's all I'm going to say in preliminaries. I hope you enjoy this talk, and as I say, thank you very much indeed for joining in with it. I want to talk today, as I say, about this wonderful, wonderful poem, the most beautiful poem in my view, practically in the most powerful poem in the English language, to the memory of my beloved the author. It's the biggest poem in the prefatory material by Ben Jonson, and I'm going to give it an unapologetic Oxfordian spin. I hope that those of you who are not Oxfordians will forgive me and listen at least with an open mind, and if you can take things away that suit your candidate, very well. If you can't, as I said at the beginning, come and join the De Vere Society, because that's what we're there for. Okay, so I think to understand Ben Jonson at all, you have to know that he is a big player of double meanings, numbers, and classical allusions, and those are the 3 things I'm going to point at. I have written a long and fulsome essay on this poem, and I go through every part of it. There isn't time for that now, so I'm just going to bring some highlights. This copy of peer-reviewed journal, The Scientific Exploration, is available. There are some copies there if you want to buy them. But as I say, I'm just going to pinpoint some highlights today.
double meanings, numbers, and classical allusions, and an understanding of Ben Jonson, who was a very wily fox, to say the least. He was known by his contemporaries Jasper Mayne and William Cartwright as the Prince of Numbers and Great Soul of Numbers. And we're going to explain the relevance of numbers. I know that some of you are aware that numbers was a word that could be used for verses, but it goes much deeper than that. And the actual connection to numbers themselves hold very deep meanings. We will come to it. He was also known as Horace II by Thomas Dekker, our English Horace, Horace of our times by his contemporaries. So he absolutely loved Horace, and in his play, Poetaster, he even cast himself as Horace. And again, I would say if you don't understand numbers or the connection of numbers of the poem we're about to talk about, and you don't understand the connection to Horace, then you're simply skim reading this poem, because you need to understand what he's banging on about to get to the bottom of it. People were quite rude, actually, about Ben Jonson's panegyric, but mainly later. I think Dryden called it an insolent sparing and invidious panegyric. And Edmund Malone, the great Shakespeare scholar, called it a clumsy sarcasm, and many malevolent reflections were contained in it. They didn't understand it because they weren't concentrating, as we are all doing here, and they weren't part of the elite brain crew who actually understand what Jonson's banging on about, and they didn't understand his double meanings. They didn't understand his numbers and his allusions to Horace. That's what we're going to look at now. This man I'm looking at now, that's a picture of Jonson, made between 1623, 24 to 26. It's got verses underneath it by Abraham Holland. So it was shortly after the first folio came out. And Holland writes here, there's Holland's name comes up. It's in Latin, but I translate it. Behold the image of Jonson, sacred high priest of the divine inspiration of the muses, recent vindicator of buried genius. This just comes out a few years after the first folio. Now you can translate vindex as vindicator or indeed as defender, but either way it seems very obvious that he is talking about Jonson's poem to Shakespeare, and Abraham Holland was a very close friend of Jonson, so he knew what was going on. And I'm going to finish this talk with another very, very fascinating thing that Abraham Holland said, which I don't think people know about. This is the front page of Jonson's works, published in 1616, and it's called The Works of Benjamin Jonson. And a lot of people scoffed at that and said that he was pushing beyond himself, because if you read the Epistle of James in the New Testament, works are supposed to be expressions of faith. And Jonson was just calling his plays and his epigrams works, which was considered extremely arrogant and naughty. But arrogance is one of the key aspects of Jonson. And in fact, if you look a little bit lower down, he quotes from Horace, his favorite poet again. I do not labor for the crowd to admire me. I am content with a few readers. As a matter of fact, Jonson has changed that quotation, because that is a quotation indeed from Horace, but he's speaking to a man called Lucius, in which Horace says, do not labor for the crowd to admire you. Be content with a few readers. Jonson has changed that to I do not labor. So he's making it very clear that he's not having any truck with anyone who's too stupid to understand his clever lines. You turn the pages, a few pages, and you get his great friend John Selden, who writes in the same book, let Palamon write his songs for the crowds in the street. You like to delight the ears of the learned, those of the few. So this is the message that's coming out about this intellectual arrogance, as I call it. Jonson's great friend, another of his great friends, was Henry Reynolds, and these shows this group of people at the time were sharing this view. Henry Reynolds writes in 1632, so that's just 9 years after the first folio, high and mystical matters should by riddles and enigmatical knots be kept inviolate from the profane multitude. This idea of profane multitude, Jonson himself talks of the sluggish, gaping auditor. These are people who don't understand what he's saying in his poems. And in that one particularly, he's talking about Stratfordianists, the ignoramus crew, the multitude whose judgments are illiterate and rude. So you see the great snobbery of people who don't understand. I can come back to his friend Reynolds here, because we're going to talk about numbers. And I know that some of you in this audience are probably going to sigh and want to leave the room and go and have a bun, rather than listen to me talking about numbers, because yes, we're on the edges of the sort of cryptological area here, but it is very, very important. Here is Jonson's friend talking about numbers. Verses remain lost to us that read and understand them not, for want merely of knowledge of that art of numbers that should unlock and explain mystical meanings to us. He's making it absolutely clear there, Reynolds, that if you don't understand numbers in some of these highly intellectual plays and what their significance and their meanings, you're simply going to miss half the meaning. I've put a picture of the cover of a book published in, I think, 1970 by Alistair Fowler. Brilliant book. He's a Stratfordianist, but never mind. And it's called Triumphal Forms, and he's one of the only really good studies I know, and a very good introductory study of how numbers work in poetry. And he gives lots and lots of examples of poets at this time who choose the exact numbers of stanzas to their poets, the exact numbers of lines, the numbers of lines that you're going to put into your headings, the number of feet, that's the metrical feet, which all have inner significance. I mean, for instance, George Chapman writes a poem called Hymn to Our Saviour on the Cross, and it has 300 lines. It has 300 lines precisely because that is the isopeptic, would you say? Gematria, I use the word gematria, but in Greek it's isopsophy. The number of tau, which is the cross, which is 300. And that's why he does it. So the significance of the number to the subject matter is very clear. So I want to look at Johnson's poem with a view quickly to numbers, and you're going to see how numbers work and how specifically. So we start with a title, which is precisely 17 words long. And then he has, underneath that title, precisely 40 rhyming couplets. Now, 1740 might not mean anything to some of you there, but I can assure you there is now a scholarly industry that is now researching this extraordinary matter of 1740. And you'll find it in many references to Shakespeare. I put a list of, I won't read them through, but those are a list of contemporary or near contemporary writers writing about Shakespeare and, of course, about the Earl of Oxford, these numbers 1740. What's it all about? Well, as far as I can get to the bottom of it, in 1570, John Dee, in his famous preface to the works of Euclid, writes this paragraph: "May we be led upward by degrees, so informing our rude imagination towards the conceiving of numbers absolutely, that at length we may be able to find the number of our own name gloriously exemplified and registered in the book of Trinity, most blessed and eternal." Now, Edward de Vere found the numbers of his own name, connected it to the Trinity in the numbers 1740. And I'm not going to explain it here because we must get on with this poem because it's a long poem. We're going to read it in 4 sections. But I've put online a video lecture called The Incalculable Genius of John Dee. And I explain in that very precisely and very exactly how Edward de Vere chooses the number of his own name to be 1740. So I'm not going to tell you why he chooses that name or how he chooses it. I'm just going to show how attached he is to it. Here is his rather amazing signature, which you can see is rather precise in some weird details. If you look at the very center of it, he's using the spout of the D and the O of Oxenford to get the number 10. Then you have what the Tudors used for their plus sign at the end of a line, and you follow that line along and you get precisely 7 dashes. So 10 plus 7, we all know, is 17. If you look to the top of the signature, he has 4, what would be the raised pearls on an earl's coronet. It's always the same, always 4 dots. Actually, an earl's coronet usually when displayed has 5 dots, but he always uses 4. And underneath that, you have an M for multiply. The multiply sign that I've just done there, the one that we're all used to from school, wasn't invented until 1631 by William Oughtred. So in those days, they said multiplicare or multiply. So 4 multiplied by 10 obviously is 40. So there you've got embedded your 1740 in his signature. And I've also put something up online to show how in Oxenford, as opposed to Oxford, there are 3 more ways that 1740 are embedded, but I won't go into them now. Very important to Edward de Vere. Of course, if you're Edward de Vere and you want to have a pseudonym, then what are you going to want to do most of all? You're going to want to reflect your magical number that connects you to the Holy Trinity in your pseudonym. So we have there the double V, and notice how those V's don't even touch. Actually, a W was known as a double V in those days, not as a double U, and there was no double V or W in Latin. And using Latin gematria, I've put a list of it underneath there, where A is 1, B is 2. Now, please, everybody who's not doesn't understand this, don't just think that's babyish and it's silly and it's irrelevant. It absolutely is not. People in those days believed very strongly that God created the world using letters and numbers. And if you want to understand God and get close to God, then you must understand the number of all things. And that means the letters of all things. So double V is 2 20s, which is obviously 40. And then Ilium Shakespeare, which is, yes, you've guessed it, 17 letters. So he's reflected the number of his name in that William Shakespeare. And of course, he's been more than that. He's been even cleverer, because Ilium is Troy, as we all know. And it was at Troy where the patron goddess of plays, Pallas, Minerva to the Latins, where she shook her spear to enable Achilles to slay Hector. So it's a perfect allusion to the patron saint of playwrights, and also the double V, which is Vere's motto, Vero nihil Verius. It's even got the nothing in between it. Actually, I have a seal ring of the Veres right here, which has a V on one side and a V on the other side, and of course a big naught in the middle, Vero nihil Verius. And as we know, many of us know, Edward de Vere signed himself off in a pamphlet of one of his servants, John Lilly, yours at an hour's warning, double V. At an hour's warning, of course, is exactly 17 letters, and double V gives you your 40. So he's signing himself off, yours 1740. And he does this all the time. And talking of the first folio, of course, in the first folio, the last speech of Hamlet, "Oh, I die, Horatio." And at the very end of that last speech, the rest is silence, dot, that's 17 characters, oh, 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 dies. That's 4 O's, dies. 1740 dies. He's telling you that he is Hamlet, and as Oxfordians know perfectly well, it's very autobiographical Hamlet. This whole thing comes to a sort of head, really, in 1740 with the monument at Westminster Abbey. As you can see in this old picture of it, it used to have 17 spears sitting in front of it, and Shakespeare standing, making the sign of a great big 4 and crossing his legs for the 10 of the X. So you've got 1740 on a monument that was put up in 1740. And then, of course, he's pointing to this famous thing, the cloud-cut towers. As everybody knows, that line shouldn't be there. It comes later in the speech. He's taken out the E of towers in order to have 17 letters across the top, and then the 4 T's coming down the bottom there, 1740. And before you say I'm just being silly, and that's a silly pun, this goes back certainly to the 1580s when John Dee, in his discussions with the Archangel Michael, discusses the connection of the number 40 with 4T, the 4 letters, so it has a long history of that. I want to get off this subject and get onto this poem as fast as I can. So just quickly, this is the first time we ever hear the name William Shakespeare in a literary context. As all of you know, it is the dedication to Venus and Adonis. If you look at it there, you can see that it's a great big block of italicized writing, basically, surrounded by 2 items. One is a highly decorated capital R. If you look down at the bottom, R is the 17th letter of the Latin Gematria. And then you have, at the end, your honours in all duty, comma, William Shakespeare, which is precisely 40 characters. So you've got 1740. And on we could go, but I must get on with the poem, but I'm trying to stress with you the importance of numbers. Now, you can read this as you like. You can take it or leave it. It doesn't matter to me, really. But there, of course, you've got your R double V. That's 1740, just underneath the author. And as I've just explained to you, you've got the double V, Ilium Shakespeare. That's your 4017 reflected underneath the word author. That last line also has 17 characters into it. If you take this extraordinarily large, bold, the author, and take the capital letters of that and do the gematria values on that, it comes to 98. 98 is 9 plus 8, which is 17. And then below it, Master William Shakespeare, and what he has left us, well, yeah, you don't have to count them, but I'll just tell you that is exactly 40 letters. So you've got your 1740 there as well. Okay, but what I want to talk about, another aspect of this title is... all right, well, we've got to get on. But we've got to get on with the poem. We've got to get on with the poem. I'm still stuck on the title, so I haven't got very far, and I'm very sorry. I did in a recent debate, some of you may have been there, in the Middle Temple, I discussed how the fact that the author in this title is written much, much bigger than the word William Shakespeare, as though what he's really trying to remember is the author and that Shakespeare isn't the proper name. If you look at the A of author and compare it, for instance, to the A of William Shakespeare beneath it, it's almost double the size. Why didn't he write to the memory of my beloved William Shakespeare, nice big letters, and what he has left to me? What is the point of interspersing with the author really, really big, unless he's trying to separate the author from the name William Shakespeare? And that's what we're going to look at in the opening now of this poem. So I'm going to call on Sir Derek to read these opening lines. All I'll say preliminary to them is, you can see I've pointed out line 17. Here we go again. I therefore will begin. So he's not even going to begin the poem until line 17. So what therefore is he doing with the first 16 lines? Well, the first 16 lines, now we're back to Horace, is called a recusatio, or a refusal. Now, Horace was famous for his refusals. The most famous of his refusals was his refusal to do what the Emperor Augustus asked him. Augustus was furious with Horace and said, "Why don't you write about me as a familiar friend, as a real man, not just as this icon who is emperor? Why don't you do that? And why don't you also, while you're doing it, mention a brilliant military victory I recently had?" And Horace then writes the epistle to Augustus, which is in verse, in which he refuses to do the military defeat. And he says, "I won't talk of you of a familiar man either, because that will only cause jealousy." Instead, he bangs on about plays and discusses early plays and late plays and comparing them. So that is the refusal upon which he's writing this. Now, Derek's going to read it, and you can decide for yourselves what you think that Ben Jonson is refusing to do in these first 16 lines.
To the memory of my beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare, and what he hath left us. To draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name, am I thus ample to thy book and fame, while I confess thy writings to be such as neither man nor muse can praise too much. 'Tis true, and all men's suffrage, but these ways were not the paths I meant unto thy praise. For silliest ignorance on these may light, which, when it sounds at best, but echoes right. Or blind affection, which doth ne'er advance the truth, but gropes and urgeth all by chance. Or crafty malice might pretend this praise, and think to ruin where it seemed to raise. These are, as some infamous bawd or whore should praise a matron. What could hurt her more? But thou art proof against them, and indeed above the ill fortune of them, or the need. I, therefore, will begin.
Thank you, Derek, very much. And for those who don't know, Derek is the honourable patron of the De Vere Society, and we're very, very proud to have him as that. And long may he live and thrive. Beautifully read. So, what is Jonson refusing to do? To draw no envy, Shakespeare, in brackets, on thy name. Well, as we all know, praise and envy always go hand in hand. He is not going to praise Shakespeare's name, which is why he shoves it into brackets there. But these ways were not the paths I meant unto thy praise. What will happen? What will go wrong if he praises Shakespeare's name? Well, he gives three ideas of what's going to go wrong, and they connect very much to those famous three monkeys. You know, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, because they deal with those three things. The first, he says that those of silliest ignorance will simply mistake a real sound for an echo. The second, those of blind affection will just end up groping in the dark in search of truth. Now, both these statements of Jonson's are about truth. The silliest ignorance, and of course he mentions the truth about groping blindly In a later work, in his Discoveries, he writes, "Ignorance is the darkener of man's life, the common confounder of truth, with which a man goes groping in the dark, no otherwise than he were blind." He's almost tipping us off there to what he wrote about Shakespeare in the first folio. The third reason he gives why he's not going to praise Shakespeare's name concerns craft and malice, saying that those of crafty malice will build up the name of Shakespeare deliberately because they know it's not his name in order to sink the real author. And once again, he gives a clue to this in his work, later work called Discoveries. Without truth, there you go again, all the actions of mankind are craft, malice, or what you will, rather than wisdom.
Okay, a brief interruption of myself here to make a point that I should have made in this speech, where I'm concentrating more on not being over-exuberant and overexcited. So Johnson, as I have shown, gives 3 reasons why he will not praise the name Shakespeare, and all 3 of those reasons are connected to truth. And of course, if you are looking for the true name of the author, a name that will get you closer to the truth than Shakespeare, well, that name is, of course, Vere. And if you look at this poem that Edward de Vere is thought to have written to his wife when he thought she was lying to him back in 1576, you can see how many Vere words, veram, vero, vera, vera, are included. Translates, of course, into English. Words of truth are fitting to a Vere, lies are foreign to the truth, and only true things stand fast. All else is fluctuating and comes to an end. Therefore, since thou, a Vere, art wife and mother of a Vere daughter, and seeing that thou mayst with good hope look forward to being mother of an heir of the Veres, may thy mind always glow with love of truth, and may thy true motto be ever lover of the truth, etc., etc., etc. Anthony Mundy, writing in Mirror of Mutability in 1579, you can see how he's addressing the Earl of Oxford and particularly talking of his motto, vero nihil verius, which means both nothing truer than truth and nothing truer than Vere, showing that truth and Vere are essentially the same word. And you can see how he peppers his poem with points about repelling falsehood, truth, 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 mentioned many times there. This is something published in 1578 by the Cambridge Don Gabriel Harvey. Again, it is addressed to the Earl of Oxford. You can see vero nihil verius on the left, and you can see how many words, once again, Vere words, are there talking about truth, but obviously connecting the word truth to Vere. Is this a picture of Vere? Truly nothing is truer, nothing truer than this. That's its merit and his, for his name embraces truth. And on and on and on he goes, writing really quite a lot of tosh. But that's not my point. My point is that everybody at the time knew of the connection between the name Vere and truth, which still exists today in the words verily, very, veracious, etc., etc. So what I am arguing here is that while Ben Jonson is saying, do not praise the name Shakespeare, and giving all the reasons for it which are connected with truth, he is, of course, giving a massive hint that the name you really should be looking for is Vere. Okay, back to my speech.
He ends up with this rather strange remark, comparing it to a matron, which is a married wife, to a whore. And again, he's taking this from Horace, Epistle to Lollius. As a matron and whore differ in temper and tone, so will the friend be distinct from the faithless flatterer. So keep reading the Horace and we'll understand more. I therefore will begin, as we said, that starts on line 17. And so I am going to call upon Annabel to read lines 17 to 40. Now, before you say to me, you've just pulled out 1740. You've just got 1740 to prove a point. No, I'm sorry, I haven't. He said, I will begin, so that obviously starts a new section. And then he talks directly to my Shakespeare. This is obviously his version of Shakespeare that isn't the silly version that's governed by blind affection, crafty malice, and deaf ears. So it's my Shakespeare. And he goes on addressing my Shakespeare in the thee, thy form until the end of line 40. And then, as we're going to see, he changes his address to Britain. He starts the next section of 40 lines. So lines 17 to 40, you can see that he's using 1740, not only just for his title, he's using it to structure the way he's going to write this poem. And we're going to understand why, because he understands 1740, just as Hamlet does, to mean Edward de Vere. Okay, let's have Annabel reading 1740.
Oh my God. To be on stage with this guy. Soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage. My Shakespeare, rise. I will not lodge thee by Chaucer or Spencer, or bid Beaumont lie a little further to make thee a room. Thou art a monument without a tomb, and art alive still while thy book doth live, and we have wits to read and praise to give. That I not mix thee so, my brain excuses, I mean with great but disproportioned muses. For if I thought my judgment were of years, I should commit thee surely with thy peers, and tell how far thou didst our Lily outshine, or Sporting Kid, or Marlowe's mighty line. And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, from thence to honour thee I would not seek for names, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles to us, Pacuius, Accius, him of Cordova dead, to life again, to hear thy buskin tread and shake a stage. Or, you might have to explain this, when thy socks were on, leave thee alone for the comparison of all that insolent Greece or haughty Rome sent forth, or since did from their ashes come.
Thank you. Thank you. I would love to explain all of these lines, which I feel confident I can do, but we don't have time. I'm just literally picking out some points which I think are fun and worthy, and some points which you will know about and some which you won't. I can gloss this in 5 seconds. Thou art a monument without a tomb. I mean, this is a very interesting point that Ben Jonson's making, that there is no tomb for William Shakespeare. And he's going to come back to that at the end of the poem. Some of you might not have noticed that allusion. But I just put it here because, of course, if you're a Stratfordianist, you think he does have a tomb and that it's up in Stratford-upon-Avon, and it says, don't lift this and don't look under it and don't have anything to do with it. But anyway, it's just curious that he says that. He must have known whether there was a tomb or not, and he says there isn't one. So there we have it. Then we come to this little bit about Lily and Kidd. Now, Oxfordians have often pointed out that Marlowe, Lily, and Kidd don't appear to have written any plays, really, after 1593, which is when the name Shakespeare first appears. In fact, they are considered to be playwrights of the 1580s. The 1580s, of course, when the Earl of Oxford was the most powerful man in British theatre, because he was the patron of about 6 different theatre companies, and that he was also, we know, hiring John Lilly as his secretary, and also Anthony Mundy. There's no other person like him who seems to be multiple playwrights around his table. And my argument very strongly is that he was also the patron of Kidd and Marlowe. So when people ask me whether I'm a Marlovian, I say I do think that Marlowe had a hand in it, and I've put some very strong evidence online to show that Marlowe was indeed working up to 1591, when Oxford went bust, and all of those poor playwrights got kicked out of St. Peter's Hill, where he had his scriptorium, and Marlowe went off and started forging coins in the Netherlands, and another one went off, was it Lodge, who went off with Captain Cavendish and sailed around the world, and Green was all very poor and everyone fell to pieces. And that was the end of the scriptorium in 1591 when Oxford went bust. There are some key little words in here. You see Lily, Marlowe, and Kidd, he outshines them. Who outshines whom? The sun is the outshiner of people. The sun, of course, is Apollo. He is the patron. So we are talking about Vere here, I believe, as patron, and they as disproportioned muses. Who do the muses all dance around? The little muses. They dance around Apollo. They are the servants of Apollo, all 9 of them. So there are little clues right here to say we're talking about Shakespeare as a patron. And we're going to see in the next bit of reading, and all the muses still were in their prime when, like Apollo, he came forth to warm our ears, or like a Mercury to charm. I put next to that picture of Edward de Vere Won't read it out, but you can see there's a list of contemporaries there who all likened him to Apollo or said he was Apollo in some way or another. This Apollo baton, I give it to the Baconians after Oxford died, was picked up by Bacon. But Bacon and Oxford are the two people who are most likened to Apollo, and they were never likened at the same time. It was Oxford first, and then Bacon when he got his scriptorium running. This picture, there's been squabbles about it for many years, saying portrait of an unknown man holding a hand. Well, I mean, we started unraveling this a long time ago, and it's now beyond any doubt that this is the Earl of Oxford. He's got a hat with feathers on it, symbolizing his connection to Mercury, and he's holding the hand of Apollo. There was a very good book about it written by a Stratfordianist called Leslie Hodson, Shakespeare by Hilliard, and he argued brilliantly that this was Shakespeare. He didn't, of course, understand that Hilliard didn't go around painting merchants from the Midlands, but he painted courtiers. And you only have to look carefully at this. If there are some Baconians among you, I'm sure you'll see in that square how 1740 can be easily encrypted from that. But I will move on. I know we can get bogged down with 1740. I put online. I thought an interesting, and I do urge you to go and look at it if you're curious. I put online a whole lecture, which is called Was Christopher Marlowe Shakespeare's Servant? And I give all the evidence in that, and I think it's extremely compelling. Marlowe, of course, was a very poor scholar, and of course he would have gone straight to the Earl of Oxford for help if he wanted to get involved in playwriting. As Robert Greene writes of Oxford, he was a favourer and fosterer of learning to whom all scholars flock. And as Thomas Nash said, all poor scholars acknowledge him as their patron, providitor, and supporter, for there cannot be a threadbare cloak sooner peep forth, but he straight presses it to be an outbrother of his bounty. So he was the go-to place for poor scholar playwrights to go to. There's a famous letter by Thomas Kidd saying that he worked together in a room with Christopher Marlowe for a lord writing plays. And people are so scared of the Earl of Oxford that even in their analysis of this, they don't even mention him, which is absolutely bonkers, considering he was the most involved in plays of anyone at that stage. And they say, oh no, he's talking about Pembroke, or he's talking about Lord Strange. But in fact, if they read what Kidd said properly, never could my lord endure Marlowe's name or sight when he had learned of his conditions. He learnt that he was an atheist, and he was part of the crew, I'm absolutely certain, he was chucked out with Nash in 1591 from Oxford's rooms in Peters Hill. And obviously from that statement, if we're going to believe it, Oxford would not have associated his name with Marlowe thereafter. So he could not be Pembroke, because we have Marlowe's name on the quarto with the Pembroke's men, and he couldn't have been Strange, whose name is also associated with Marlowe after that date. Okay, hope you don't think I'm rushing too much. I'm going to do very quickly on the question of small Latin and less Greek. We know what the Stratfordians have to say about this, and it's obviously potty, because anyone who's read Shakespeare knows that he's learned, and he sets a whole play of Plautus in the Menechmi, etc., etc. However, where it connects very, very strongly to Oxford, this line, is that Oxford was at the forefront of a movement, of anti-scholastic movement, to get Latin and Greek out of the English language, to get rid of inkhorn words and to get rid of this ridiculous pedantism that insisted that if you're going to write poems and things, you've got to lean on the grammatical pedantry of a 5th century person called Priscian. And in Europe, the movement was headed by a man called Ramus, Pietro Ramus, who was also an anti-scholastic. The whole idea of getting rid of the unities of Aristophanes, for instance, which is something we know Shakespeare did, was very, very key to all of Oxford's thinking, and that's what he stood for. Now, I've written an article called That Famous Persecutor of Priscian, Oxford, Shakespeare, and the Repurification of English. That has a lot of the details in it. Out there is a very, 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 very splendid and beautiful set. It's expensive. It's £90, a limited edition of 300 copies. This article is reproduced in there if you want to read it. And obviously, I don't have time much to go over it here. I'll just say that Nash was the one who called Oxford the famous persecutor of Priscian, and talked about his wonted Chaucerisms. What Oxford was doing was mining Chaucer, Lydgate, all those old writers to get English words back into the English language, where previously there'd been a sort of pointless reliance on Latin and Greek in the classics. And so Nash, addressing Oxford, says, "May Chaucer be new scoured against the day of battle, and Terence come but in now and then with a snuff of a sentence." So let's keep Terence out of this. Of course, Oxford got very mocked for his reliance on Chaucer, and mocked particularly by Gabriel Harvey, who sneers, "Stout, lout, plain swain, quotha lording." He's talking about Oxford using Chaucerian words in his famous libel against Oxford of 1582. Nash, again, this is a quote, "By his pen, Oxford achieved high fame as the first in our language that re-purified poetry from art's pedantism and instructed it to speak courtly." So that's what Ben Jonson's going on about. Johnson didn't approve, by the way, of this idea of having Chaucerisms in. He didn't like it, and he was rude about it elsewhere. But he realizes what Oxford was doing. So what he's really talking about is not the person being bad at Latin and Greek. He's talking about the works. And what he's saying is, although you had only a little bit of Latin and Greek stuff in your works, still I'm happy to show you off to sum up these names from the past. Okay, I've got to go faster, I can tell that, so we're going to move on. This is the next section, and as I said, it starts a new section. And we know it's a new section because he's now addressing Britain. "Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show." So we're going now into the last 40 lines, of course, of the poem. And he is addressing Britain, but you will notice that he changes address on the 17th line of this page. "Thy art, my gentle Shakespeare." So every time he gets back to my Shakespeare, he does that little 1740 trick. And interestingly enough, this line appears 40 lines on from where he started, saying, "Soul of the age, my Shakespeare rise." So he moves 40 lines on, 17 lines down, and he changes his address now back to Shakespeare. I think we all know this, really. My gentle Shakespeare. Stratfordianists will say, if he picked up a vase, he was very careful not to drop it or something ridiculous. But no, you only have to go to the Oxford English Dictionary. Gentle means well-born, belonging to a family of position, originally used synonymously with noble. Thank you very much. Okay, let's hear these lines, which Costa's going to read to us. Section.
"Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time, and all the muses still were in their prime, when like Apollo he came forth to warm our ears, or like a Mercury to charm. Nature herself was proud of his designs, and joyed to wear the dressing of his lines, which were so richly spun, and woven so fit, as since she will vouchsafe no other wit. The merry Greek, tart Aristophanes, neat Terence, witty Plautus now not please, but antiquated and deserted lie as they were not of nature's family. Yet must I not give nature all? Thy art, my gentle Shakespeare, must enjoy a part. For though the poet's matter nature be, his art doth give the fashion, and that he who casts to write a living line must sweat, such as thine are, and strike the second heat upon the muse's anvil, turn the same, and himself with it, that he thinks to frame, or for the laurel he may gain a scorn, for a good poet's made, as well as born, and such wert thou.
Thank you, Costa. I will try and gloss this quite smoothly and quickly and tell you why it applies especially to Edward de Vere. What you hear here is a bit of an argument about nature versus art. Art, of course, from which the word artifice comes. That's the craft, the effort, the skill, all the thought and the hammering away at it to make it good. The nature, if you like, could be the genius, but he talks about nature's matter is the subject of poetry, i.e. everything in the world, and not just talking about trees and fawns. Anything that poetry writes about is effectively writing about nature. But art is what makes a great poet, and this was absolutely fundamental to the philosophy, the aesthetic philosophy of Edward de Vere, and it was very well known at the time because he published it in, well, as we know from Bodenham, all his poems were published under other people's names, so we know that from 1600, but we're not talking about a poem, we're talking about a preface that he wrote in Latin to a book called The Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. And in that preface, he talks about this very subject. He talks about art versus nature. And he has a very specific philosophy, Oxford. He says that by your art, through your effort, He says you can surpass others, and by surpassing others, you will surpass yourself. And when you surpass yourself, you will be able to surpass nature. And that is what he says, and that's picked up by Gabriel Harvey, who says, oh, that's a very clever thing you said there, Oxford. And I predict the same of you, he says, in 1578. He says, you have surpassed others, you will surpass yourself, and you will now surpass nature. And he puts it, Gabriel Harvey, in very much that way that Ben Jonson puts it here. He's talking about a cloak, a clothing. You'll clothe nature. You see this extended metaphor that we've just heard of talking about Shakespeare's lines that are the clothes on nature. So that is where I think he's getting it from. Now, he talks about nature, and then he gives the counter-argument. This is the Oxfordian counter-argument. Where does he give it? He gives it on line 57. What's the relevance of line 57? Well, it's 17 plus 40, isn't it? Now, if you take where Costa started reading Triumph My Britain and go down 17 lines, you come to line 57, 1740. Now we've got Edward de Vere's point about art. Edward de Vere wrote in 1571, although nature herself has made nothing perfect in every detail, yet the fashion or manners of men exceed in dignity that with which nature has endowed them. And Johnson in this poem says, his art doth give the fashion, that the race of his mind and manners brightly shines through his well-turned, true-filed lines. So you can see what he is alluding to there. This went into about 7 editions, Edward de Vere's preface to Castiglione. So it was very well known by all intellectuals who understood what this whole argument about art and nature was and how Edward de Vere was at the forefront of talking about it. Okay, I think we can move on. I don't know why I did that, just to bait people. Okay, take it off again. Oh, that's about Apollo and Mercury. I think we've dealt with that. Right, we're coming to the last section now, so I hope your tummies aren't too much rumbling. And I've got some interesting things to say, so I'll try and do it speedily, but so it doesn't lose its import. I think shall we just go straight into the reading of this? We're going to have Richard Clifford's very kindly going to read it for us. And this is the last 17 lines, if you count, so I'm prepared to let you say I'm cheating here. But if you count Ben Jonson at the bottom, then we are talking about the last 17 lines here. So let's have them.
Look how the Father's face lives in his issue. Even so, the race of Shakespeare's mind and manners brightly shines in his well-turned and true-filed lines, in each of which he seems to shake a lance, as brandished at the eyes of ignorance. Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that did so take Eliza and our James. But stay, I see thee in the hemisphere advanced, and make a constellation there. Shine forth, thou star of poets, and with rage or influence chide or cheer the drooping stage, which since thy flight from hence hath mourned like night and despair's day, but for thy volume's light. Ben Jonson.
Wonderful, thank you, Richard. Just a few things I want to say about this. I think there's a double meaning going on here. We talked about double meanings. We can come to another big one in a second. Look how the Father's face lives in his issue. Now, those of you, a lot of readings of the sonnets, when he uses the word lines, he's sometimes double meaning and talking about hereditary lines. When he used the word, to Oxfordians, I apologize to the rest of you, but sometimes when he uses the word verses, he's punning on veers. So veers and lines are hereditary lines. And when Jonson comes in here talking about the Father's face lives in his issue, he does seem to be talking not just about these wonderful lines that Shakespeare wrote, but about the issue. And he talks about the true-filed lines, in each of which he seems to shake a lance, and how well-turned they are. Well, the dedicatee, as we all know, to the first folio is Philip Lord Montgomery, who married Shakespeare's daughter. He married Edward de Vere's daughter, and you can see her there looking rather glum. And the reason she's looking glum is because she's dead. She's a ghost, and she was wheeled into this wonderful portrait by Van Dyck, and you can see all her children there looking towards the ghost, and the father trying to say, don't worry about your mother's ghost, move on to his heir. You're about to marry this young lady. But if you look carefully at what's going on, they're all deeply aware of the mother's death. So that's Edward de Vere's youngest daughter, who Oxfordians see rather as the Cordelia in the King Lear story. So that I think there's a double meaning possibly going on here, that he's tipping his cap, Johnson, to the dedicatee of the first folio, who was Philip Montgomery, to say how wonderful his children and his true filed lines and the father's face, and how wonderful the literal heirs of the body of Shakespeare are. Now we come to this. I think everybody knows the answer to Sweet Swan of Avon, so I don't really have to spend much time on it. I first published on this in 2014 in the Oxfordian, and I was delighted to see that people even like Stanley Wells, who never wants to read anything, they all know about it now, and it's really upsetting for them. But we all know what it is. We're talking about the Sweet Swan of Avon. We're talking about something on the banks of the Thames where Eliza and James went and listened to the Shakespeare plays. We know they never went to a public theatre, and what I discovered back in 2014 was Avon was another word for Hampton Court. We don't have poor old Shakespeare Stratford anywhere near Hampton Court as far as we know, but obviously Oxford was in and out of the place the whole time. If you look at Ben Jonson's great teacher and the person he looked up to so much, he writes about Hampton Court in his book called Britannia, very famous book. And he talks about the river, the Thames, that runneth hard by Hampton Court, a royal palace of the kings. And then he gives a quotation from Leyland, the antiquarian poet. A stately place for rare and glorious show there is, which Thames with wandering stream doth douse, times past by name of Avon men it knew. So it was known as Avon, and I've written an article about it that I think is reprinted in volume 3 of those Oxfordians, and I give lots and lots of citations of people who fully understand that Avon was a name for Hampton Court. Sweet Swan of Avon, therefore, is talking about a courtier poet, particularly connected with Hampton Court, where King James and Eliza loved to watch plays. Okay, now I'm taking you to the last lines, and I think this is a really, really interesting thing. He says that Shakespeare is made into a constellation, and many scholars have said, well, that constellation has to be Cygnus, because it appears in the very same sentence as Sweet Swan of Avon, and the only constellation in the sky to do with the swan is, of course, Cygnus. And that makes a lot of sense. In point of fact, there is the Cygnus in an old map. I can draw it out for you. And once again, we're going back to Horace. And again, the learned few, the clever ones, not the gaping auditors, the ones who bother to look at the Horace, will see why Johnson decides to bring up this metaphor. Horace writes one of his odes called The Poet Prophesies His Own Death. He's writing about his own death and immortality as a poet. And he writes, on no common or feeble pinion shall I soar through the liquid air, a poet still, nor linger more on earth. Even now the wrinkled skin is gathering on my ankles, and I am changing to a snowy swan above, and o'er my arms and shoulders is spreading a soft plumage. Restrain all clamour and forego the idle tribute of a tomb. So there again is your second allusion to the fact that he has no tomb, that this writer Shakespeare is transformed, as a great poet would be, as Horace was, to a swan, the constellation of the swan in the sky without a tomb. Now here's the very odd thing about this, is he calls him a constellation, and in the very next line, Johnson calls him a star. And that's bizarre. I mean, how can you be a star and a constellation? A constellation is, by its definition, a set of stars. And Johnson wasn't stupid, so let's please not say he just made a mistake. He wasn't thinking, he wasn't concentrating. He was concentrating very hard indeed, and I'm going to show you how he was concentrating. But what I want to do here is to say to ourselves, if it's so easy to recognize what constellation he's talking about, it's Cygnus, can we not identify the exact star that he's talking about, and what connection that star might have to Cygnus? Now, we're only left with 4 lines of this poem, and I'm going to show you that you can identify the exact star of the billions of stars that are up in the sky that he is actually talking about right here. So what have we got to work with? With rage or influence, chide or cheer the drooping stage. Now, we all know that the stage is a metaphor for the world. All the world's a stage. Shakespeare didn't invent that. He got it, it goes right back to Pythagoras. So let's take stage to mean the world. So we're looking for a star that can influence the world, criticize or influence the world. What else have we got? Since thy flight from hence, that means since your death, Shakespeare, this star has appeared tinkling away up in the night sky. So the new star has to have appeared shortly after Shakespeare's death. And what else do we have? We have, had it not been for the light of this star, we would have had miserable nights and miserable days. That tells us something very important, doesn't it? It tells us that this star was visible both by night and by day. Well, there aren't that many stars that are visible by night and by day. And I'm now going to just throw an extra thing in for good measure, which is this star, at least in Johnson's mind, had to have some connection with Cygnus, because he's just connected it to Cygnus. It doesn't mean it's a star within the constellation of Cygnus. So I'm going to start with that. Here is a picture that Ben Jonson knew very well indeed, because he describes it in detail in a masque he wrote called The Fortunate Isles. And it's a Rosicrucian thing, and I don't need to go into most of the details. Let's just look at the top of it, the top of this picture. You can see top left and top right, there are two stars, are there not? One of those stars, that's the one on the right, seems to pass through a swan, Cygnus, and the one on the left passed through the constellation of Ophiuchus, also known as Serpentaria, as the man holding the serpent. And you can see the rays coming down, influencing mankind with the word vide armini on them, both of them, which means may you be seen, may you be perceived. And you will notice just beneath the snake of Serpentaria the date 1604. Now, some of you might know that the Earl of Oxford died in late June 1604 and was buried in July 1604. Less than 3 months later, a new star appeared in the sky. And that star is known as Kepler's supernova, or SN 1604. People wrote about it. It was a huge issue at the time, massive, massive issue. Galileo wrote about it. Kepler wrote this book about it called De Stella Nova, which means of the new star in the foot of Serpentaria, and he linked it with a star that had appeared in the night sky earlier in 1574, the star in Cygnus. And these two stars were meant to influence mankind. And here is it. I've done a very, very bad effort to try and draw the constellation of Serpentaria. There it is in the foot, Kepler's supernova, in the foot of Serpentaria. Now, what did Kepler write about this supernova that suddenly appeared in October? He wrote, it first appeared, so Kepler observed it at the time, where he was in Bavaria or somewhere, and wrote this book about it. He said it first appeared on the 8th of 9th of October 1604, was brighter at its peak than any other star in the night sky, and was visible both by night and by day over 3 weeks. It then disappeared, and we'll come to this at the very end of what I've got to say today. It came by no accident, this is Kepler's words, it came by no accident but by God's purpose, using his rules of astrology to exhort humans who are dependent on him and to inform them of his opinions. So let us just go back quickly to that checked thing. We're looking for a star that was said to criticize and influence in the world, yes, by no less than Kepler. A star that first appeared after Shakespeare's death. Now, if you're a Stratfordianist, Shakespeare died in 1616. No new star appeared in the night sky between 1616 and 1623 in time for Jonson to have written this poem. In fact, there was no new star in the night sky visible to the human eye until 1987. So the last star that appeared in the night sky was the Kepler supernova of October 1604, 3 months after Edward de Vere was buried. So yes, tick that one, nice. A star that was visible both by night and day. Yes, for 3 weeks you could see it by night and day. And a star that in Jonson's mind had some connection to Cygnus. Now I would just rather conceitedly at that point put my tennis racket down and say game, set and match. But I just want to do one very quick thing before I do the game, set and match, is to show you some contemporary corroboration of this. And as I said, I was going to come back to Abraham Holland, with whom I kicked off, because Abraham Holland, a few years after the first folio came out, and as I say, great friend of Ben Jonson's, he wrote an elegy on the death of Henry, Earl of Oxford, who was Edward de Vere's son, the 18th Earl of Oxford, who died in 1625, so just 2 years after the first folio came out. Now, sorry, there's your Abraham Holland, so we'll get straight to this point. There's a picture of Henry Vere. And here is the elegy. Not going to read it to you, don't worry. It's just a tiny bit of it I'm going to show to you because I think it's absolutely fascinating what is going on in here. So he starts off with a a title for the 18th Earl of Oxford, and yes, you've guessed it, it's 18 words long. Just as, in fact, Thomas Bedingfield, when he's doing a title to dedicate something to the 17th Earl of Oxford, uses 17 words to do it. So one is back to the query of why the hell Ben Jonson chose to have 17 words when he wanted to write to the memory of my beloved, the author. And the question I'm going to ask here is whether Abraham Holland was fully aware of what I've just told you about Kepler's supernova, and that he chose to follow his poem about the 18th Earl of Oxford to follow Jonson's poem about the supernova and Shakespeare and take it on from there with the 18th Earl of Oxford. That's what I'm going to look at very, very quickly. Now, you remember the star disappeared in the night sky. It went, it vanished, Kepler's supernova. Let's see how Abraham Holland begins this poem to the 18th Earl of Oxford. What star was wanting in the sky? What place to be supplied anew? What empty space that required Oxford? Was some light grown dim, some star decrepit, that suborned him to dark the earth by his departure? Ooh, that's odd. He's talking about a star that's disappeared that needs Oxford to replace it. Now, I've just given you my interpretation that Ben Jonson says that place, that was the Kepler supernova that then disappeared after 3 days. We just go on just a tiny bit. Now, remember how odd I said it was that Ben Jonson compares Shakespeare to a constellation, and in the very next line he calls him a star. What a rum thing to do. How peculiar. What's happening here? About the 18th Earl of Oxford, a brighter star, or like a new Orion. In 2 consecutive lines, he's a star, and then he's a constellation. Who's ever done that before, apart from Ben Jonson to Shakespeare? And now, suddenly, to the 18th Earl of Oxford. He's an armed constellation. Look what Ben Jonson says about Oxford up here. He compares him to Pallas Athena. He seems to shake a lance as brandished at the eyes of ignorance. He's talking about the fully armed Pallas, Minerva, shaking a lance. What do we have here about the 18th of Oxford? Or like a new Orion doth he stand in crystal mail, that's in full armour, and a bright blade in his hand. And finally, and then I promise I'm out of here, talking about the 18th Earl of Oxford, he shines a better Mars, brighter star. Like a comet's rage strikes he amazement on the trembling age. Is this not an allusion to what Jonson says about Shakespeare? Shine forth thy star of poets, and with rage or influence chide or cheer the drooping stage. Thank you.